Hi Joe, with Joe Jamison, a trade unionist from New York. He's given us a lecture, or was given a lecture at the Desmond Greaves School. The talk was Connolly, long-term legacy in America. First of all, Joe, Connolly was in America from 1903 to 1910. What positive impact did Connolly have on the American labour movement, and does that has his legacy followed through to today?
Well, his, I think unacknowledged by most historians, is that he did have a big impact. He was in the several socialist parties, but he was also, beginning in 1905, in the IWW, the Wobblies, so-called, which was syndicalism, US style. And that was an extremely significant organization. It represented a kind of radical trade unionism as distinct from the conservative AFL craft unionism. And Connolly wanted to be part of and associate with that militant tradition. So he began to be an organizer, but his achievements are not that well known. For example, toward the end of his organizing career, he brought into the IWW a unit of 12,000 dock workers, that's an enormous group. They were a pre-existing group, but he brought them into the IWW. So, so his stature was that of a national figure on the level of Big Bill Haywood, or well, Joe Hill is well known because of the song, but he was more than simply a humble activist. Within a few years, he was a national leader of the IWW. And he battled several major figures and defeated them. For example, Daniel de Leon was the sort of the grand old man of socialist politics in the US at that time. And de Leon took positions on a number of things. Connolly took them on, and Connolly won. So I think his US achievement is underrated. And finally, and this is the point of my talk, people in his circle are considered to be the founders of, or the predecessors of the CIO. That achievement is never mentioned when it comes to Connolly, and I think that's an omission. I think there's a reason for the omission, namely Irish historians want to focus on those aspects of his US years which had an impact on the climax of his life in 1913, 1916. They don't look at the question of what aspects of his activity had an impact on US trade union struggles in the next generation, or over the next 25 years. And I think the birth of the CIO in 1935 was very much part of it was a goal that Connolly was working toward when he was in the US. So he deserves the credit for that, along with other figures like Eugene Debs and Big Bill Haywood. I think these are names that would be known to an Irish audience.
And then, just from that, so like the heyday of the union movement for union density, say, mid-30s, mid-50s, where we were 40% union density in the workplace. First of all, what led to that rise in unionism, and then subsequently what led to its demise?
Well, in the mid-1930s, the CIO was formed, and it was something quite new. It was a left-center coalition. Not everybody in it was a revolutionary, but it sought to organize the mass production industries, which had been unorganized by the craft unions. And they were unwilling to organize it. And so the craft unions represented a very small percentage of the workforce. They were father-son unions. They were very elitist. They excluded women, blacks, immigrants, and so forth. So when the CIO came along, and when conditions sort of came together for that, it led to an explosion of industrial unionism. In other words, wall-to-wall unionism. In this part of the world, I think it's called general unionism. General unionism had arrived in Ireland with Larkin, and it arrived in Britain a decade earlier. But it didn't arrive in the US until 1935. And that's when if you look at the union density chart, you have this meteoric rise in union membership and union density to the point where by the early 1950s, it was hovering around 33, 35%, which is a big number. Now, since that time, well, something bad happened in the late 1940s, and that was that there was McCarthyism, there were the purges of the CIO, the left-wingers were kicked out, the left-wing unions were kicked out and then subsequently raided. Now, these were it may go down hard with some in America, but these were the forces that could have done brilliant things, and they weren't around to do it. For example, organizing the South, which has been a huge problem in the US for hundreds of years. Organizing, organizing political independence. For example, our big problem since the 19th century has been that the trade union movement is kind of a sub-movement within the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party has been seen as the instrument of social change, at least moderate social change. It is obvious that that is no longer true. And yet, we have a leadership that is unwilling to begin to take the steps to break with the Democratic Party. This idea is not so radical at a middle and lower level in the union movement, but still at the top level, there is fierce resistance and yet, for 40 years, we've been struggling to get labor law reform, which would permit growth in the private sector again. And the Democrats have been counted on to deliver that, and they don't. It didn't happen under Jimmy Carter, it didn't happen under Bill Clinton, and it hasn't happened under Barack Obama. So why don't we draw the necessary conclusion that it is not? That party is essentially a big business party, although less reactionary than the Republicans on many questions, not all. Why don't we draw that realistic conclusion and start to do something different? But that discussion doesn't arise. And I argue it's not because our leaders are unintelligent, they are intelligent people, but there's a mindset that's deeply embedded. I use the word opportunism, which a lot of people don't like to hear, but it's an idea that the way to advance is by making an alliance with capital. And that's what the alliance with the Democratic Party represents. So as long as they hold that view, the idea of beginning the steps to build political independence is anathema to them. So that's a short answer to a very profound question. Did the best I could.
Thanks. And you mentioned there just on McCarthyism, just how deep of an impact did that have on the trade union movement?
Well, it had a huge impact, and McCarthyism, there were other kinds of attacks. There were the direct legal attacks, essentially, and the Taft-Hartley Act was the worst of that, which split the left wing of the CIO from the center and right wing of the CIO. But McCarthy created, and the House Un-American Activities Committee in the other house, McCarthy was in the Senate, created a climate of irrational fear. And I don't think people in Europe or in Ireland understand just how severe the repression was. It wasn't fascism, it wasn't an open terrorist dictatorship, but it was the most severe kind of repression short of fascism, in the sense that there was a hysteria, irrational element to it. There was the mobilization of all sections of society, the government, the courts, the employers, the schools, the youth groups, the veterans group, the Catholic Church, all involved in creating an anti-communist hysteria, which was used to destroy the left, and especially destroy the left in the trade union movement, where it had some institutional power in parts of the CIO.
You mentioned the Taft-Hartley Act. Just expand on that a bit more.
Well, when the CIO was born in 1935, the birth was accompanied by the passage of something called the Wagner Act, which is the National Labor Relations Act. I'll try not to use too much Americanese and trade unionese. But it's called the Magna Carta of the union movement. It permitted the industrial unions legally to organize. Unions as a whole were illegal, totally illegal in the United States for much of all of the 19th century, and they only became legal, only the craft unions were legal subsequently. So the idea that an industrial union, which was far more radical in its implications, in other words, you're organizing everybody, including the unskilled and the most poorly paid, that idea, the legality of that was achieved in 1935 with the Wagner Act. It was called the Wagner Act. 12 years later, the right and corporations had mobilized a counteroffensive, and the counteroffensive was the Taft-Hartley Act, which especially destroyed the right to strike, and capital in the US was extremely angry because the CIO unions in 1946, the year before the Taft-Hartley Act, had launched strikes all across basic industry and were getting wage increases of 20, or in some cases 30%. So the Taft-Hartley Act had another feature, which I think which is the anti-communist affidavits. Now, people think that that has to do with, forcing an individual union official to reveal his politics or political affiliations, but it was actually much worse than that, because under the Taft-Hartley Act, any union that had a leadership that did not take the affidavit or sign the affidavit, that union was denied access to the National Labor Relations Board. You cannot function as a union in the private sector without working with the National Labor Relations Board. So it created, it caused the left-wing unions to suffer losses in terms of membership, political isolation, and later on they were raided, they were expelled from the CIO, they were raided. Very few survived, just really 2 of the 11 unions that were expelled. The rest of them, smaller, were absorbed by other unions. So it was a devastating blow to politics in America, progressive politics, and we suffered for it. We suffered for it in all the shrinkage of the social safety net. We suffered for it in this distortion of the economy thanks to wars and military spending. These things could have been opposed by a CIO that had a strong progressive current, but they were not, because that had been destroyed.
And yeah, so we did see there is a trend, as you mentioned, the chart of union density, a complete fall off. And in today's terms, what obstacles are there for the trade union to actually build up that density and to actually get trade union militancy?
Well, there is trade union militancy at a grassroots level. In fact, one of the questioners before mentioned it. There have been very militant strikes. We have Walmart workers who, there are 1.1 million Walmart workers, all of them unorganized, all of them poorly paid. They've been walking off the job and taking the consequences. Usually it means getting fired. But it shows that there is a tremendous amount of anger at the grassroots level. We have other examples of public sector, both victories and defeats, where the Chicago teachers made some significant advances in parts of the Midwest where the right-wing governors have tried to de-unionize the public sector. There have been militant fightbacks. So at a grassroots level, there's militancy. The problem is that in the United States, while unions have not been made illegal in the private sector, union organizing has been made impossible. It's not technically illegal to organize in the private sector, but especially in the last 30 years, the ability to do it is just beyond reach. It requires immense sums of money. It requires workers who are heroic, who have to expect to be fired and not rehired until something goes through the courts for 5 years. We have a whole industry of anti-union consultants, well-paid lawyers who do nothing but think about how to screw up a union organizing drive. So we desperately need labor law reform. And we haven't been able to get it because of the political means by which we count on getting it just don't work. This doesn't work anymore. So we could turn it around and start to grow again if we do a more fundamental analysis of why we have failed. And that's what I was arguing for today. There are people who think if we were smarter about using social media, there are people who we would grow. There are people who think that the union democracy is the supreme value. It's a value. There are people who champion the idea of diversity in leadership. That's an important goal as well, but they're not, those, social media is kind of gimmicky, and those other two are important policies that we should have, but they don't add up to a genuinely different policy. And that's what I'm arguing for. It's got to start with the attitude toward political independence and the Democratic Party, and after that, all things are possible, I think.
Yeah. Just one final question. Stuff you were saying about opportunism, even within the trade union, and this class collaboration between top you. Like, would you see, in general, that like the trade union movement, even you know, Ireland, America, Europe, that'd be similar challenges for the trade union movement to?
Yeah, I think I certainly don't want to criticize the Irish trade unions, not when I'm in Ireland, not anywhere really. It's not coming from a large country which has done a lot of damage to this country from time to time. I don't want to be in that position. But I would say that speaking as somebody who has studied labor history, even though I'm an amateur at it, I don't claim to be a labor historian, the same kind of compromise that led us into that period of stagnation for 40 years is working in other countries too. So for example, in the US, back in the 1950s, once all the left-wingers had been kicked out, the remaining leaders thought they had a deal. That U.S. workers in the unions would get regular wage increases and improvements in benefits, provided there was trade union support for U.S. foreign and military policy. They were quite explicit about that. There wasn't a deal. The deal got undone at a certain point, and we're still living through the consequences of that. But I think the comparable question in Europe would be the attitude to the European Union. Judging from the speeches at this conference, there's this persistent view that that the European Union has progressive social policies could emerge from it. Now, if that was true at a certain point, it's no longer true. If it seemed true at a certain point, it's no longer true. And we have the European Union following the dictates of the banks, imposing austerity all over Europe. We have the Democratic president in the United States following the dictates of the banks and imposing cuts and all sorts of objectionable policies on the U.S. working people. So that's where I would look for the parallel. I think Irish trade unionists need a little more clarity on what is the European Union. It's not a friend. It may seem like a friend, but it isn't when push comes to shove.
Joe, thanks a million, and thanks for taking the time out to speak to us.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Thank you.